Hello and welcome to CUTV News. I'm your host Adam Bema. On this week's show, CUTV has a special news report about last summer's G20 in Toronto. I'm here at Place de Canada in downtown Montreal at Square Dorchester, where many rallies have been held in the past to protest the Canadian government's actions. To commemorate the G20, I sat down with a few Montrealers to discuss their experiences at the protests and what they would like to see done.
Justin, my partner, coworker at the time, and I ended up doing some pretty heavy media and civil liberties work while we were in Toronto. We were covering the demonstrations, but I suppose the more interesting thing, the thing that picked up more media attention, was that after the mass arrests on the Sunday of the G20, we were feeling pretty defeated as journalists, as human beings, and decided that the only thing left to do would be to go to the detention center. All of my friends were already there or had disappeared, and we felt like somebody needed to tell the story of what was happening in there.
When Lex and I were there, I think we were there for about 6 to 8 hours. We got there at probably 10 p.m. And we showed up, we drove up with a bunch of food and just juice boxes and, maybe just to coax some answers out of everyone. And over the course of that entire evening, people kept showing up with food from the community, just showing up with food. A bunch of journalists, a bunch of columnists from, now, just started showing up and supporting people that were coming out. And, the cops were releasing, one person every 10 to 20 minutes, all day and all night, really, being released right up until 2 or 3, 4. I guess we left at 4 a.m. And so that was a pretty traumatic experience, probably, just getting all of their stories.
We were already hearing rumors that there was some pretty gross violations of human rights taking place, and so we went to document them. So we brought medical equipment and as many granola bars and juice boxes as we could possibly find. And from about 8 or 9 p.m. to 5 in the morning, we interviewed detainees as they were coming out of 629 Eastern, which was an old film studio that they had converted into a mass prison, specifically for the purpose of G20 arrestees. So as people were coming out, we would provide sort of a first care, first contact interaction. And if they were willing, we'd document their stories and their experiences inside of the center.
There was one writer from Maclean's who showed up and spent about half an hour there and then booked it. There was a CP24 truck, which is kind of like the 24-hour news channel in Toronto, that showed up. And CP24 trucks are weird. They have surveillance cameras at each corner. And so they pulled up, the cameras took a panoramic view, and then they left. No one actually got out. CBC came and Global came, and both of them, used it as a backdrop, but actually didn't really speak to anyone who was there. And it's really a shame, because had they taken the time to actually speak to a single human being, they would have realized that, well, maybe not with their first one, they wouldn't have believed, being held in a cage for 24 hours with barely any food, barely any water, where it's freezing, where you've been stripped of all your clothes, where they're using a bunch of sensory deprivation tactics, and where women are being forced to use the washroom with no doors in front of male police officers, and queer people are being forced into small cages and, just being rattled along by police officers. So had they taken 5 minutes and actually spoken to people, maybe they wouldn't have believed the story from the first person. And I don't know if I did, but by the time you've spoken to the 50th and the 75th person, and they've told you the exact same story as the 75 people before you, it's quite clear that something's going on.
The detention center conditions got no traction with the mainstream media for 2 weeks. I think the first call I got from CTV was a week later. And then they urgently wanted to do an interview, and it's like, guys, this has been going on for forever, you know? And then they jumped on it. But they jumped on it once it was no longer, like, actionable. But, I mean, our story was published about 4 hours after we got back. It is still the only complete assessment of the conditions inside of the center. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association has produced a massive report, is producing a massive report on testimonies. But insofar as there's like a document that talks about what happened there, what we produce is still the only one. And by 72 hours later, it had been translated into 5 languages. WordPress had sent us an email being like, what the hell is going on in your blog? Like, you're having abnormal traffic. What did you do? And then we ended up ranked in the top 5 WordPress blogs in the world that week. I think it was the top 5. I mean, it was everywhere. It was Rabble and Maisonneuve. It was media centers across the world. I remember being really confused because when I Googled my name to find out where it was, it was like one of the highest, one of the highest ranking hits was in Chinese. I'm just like, who's reading this? You know, but the story got everywhere, and we were bombarded by people who had been in the detention center, by people who really wanted us to shut up about what happened there, by people who wanted us to, I mean, it was an absurd time, right? Like, everything was moving so fast. People had a sort of general feeling that, like, this isn't right, but someone has to do something about it. And within, like, I mean, Justin is more of a journalist than I am, right? I just happen to be wearing that hat for a week and put in that space. But for me, it was really challenging, right? Because I wanted to be on the street, and after we published that report, we were afraid of going anywhere. We were afraid of getting arrested. And it's interesting because we were afraid of getting arrested the entire time, but it was interesting that all of a sudden we felt like targets. And I think a lot of people felt that way afterwards.
She handled more of like the technical stuff. She's the one with the smartphone doing all of the tweeting, and I was doing most of the writing down and taking stories. But it was a slightly different model from what I'm used to. And I mean, what came out of that weekend actually is we tried to get the story reprinted by the Canadian University Press, CUP, which is like a press cooperative that covers almost all of Canada's student newspapers, well, less and less of Canada's student newspapers. And CUP refused to publish it. I think by that time we were up into like the tens of thousands of views, right? Which, if you even want to talk in the most crassest terms just about monetizing it, is like a lot of money. If you can, put an ad or two on that page. And CUP, I think their official answer was, you need to meet with our lawyers so that they can go over all of your claims, and you're going to need to have like video proof of every claim that you're making. And at that time, I was the editor-in-chief of the Link, and I was like, well, I'm not making claims, they're facts. And they're like, well, that's up to the lawyers to decide. And I was like, well, you can't get the story then. And so, yeah, it was a really hostile attitude from actually a lot of people to reprint it. But then there were also people who had no problem reprinting it. Rabble reprinted it without problem. Maisonneuve magazine reprinted it without problems because they saw what was, a very interesting and sad story. But when it comes to like the mainstream press, I mean, it wasn't really reprinted. And so I guess it was nice to have that outlet. It was just sort of sad that then, that it didn't get expanded broader. But I mean, by the end, I think we got read by now up to about 250,000 people. And, it was translated into Italian, into a bunch of languages by the end of the first week. So blogs apparently are a good way to reach people if you, get out of a car and actually ask a few questions.
I imagine like the facts are pretty well known now. It was the largest mass arrest in Canadian history. Between the two of us, in that short period of time, we interviewed about 120 people, which is a pretty significant sample of the 900, 1,000 that were arrested that weekend. And we found that the conditions that people were being kept in were, I suppose, exactly what we had expected and feared the entire time. People were being deprived of necessary medicine, things like antiretrovirals, insulin, antipsychotics. Minors were being kept in adult cells, often without charges, so there's no way they could justify that they were being held on adult charges and therefore kept with adults. Women and queer trans people were sexually assaulted and abused. There's one story that has always been really startling to me. A woman came out probably about my age and was held for hours and hours and kept in solitary for a while. She had prisoner ID stickers put all over her body after she was forced to strip for a police officer. There was no reasonable grounds for a search like that or that sort of sexual abuse. Queer people were put in solitary confinement until they straightened up. There was a pregnant woman that came out. There was a man, this story got a lot of traction with the Toronto Star, a man that had been handcuffed to his wheelchair after being forcibly dragged into the back of a paddy wagon at one of the demonstrations. I mean, these are stories that, are, they're shocking, right? But they were the norm, right, for that weekend. And I suppose that was the interesting thing, is that basic charter rights, human rights, rights even within the context of the Canadian legal framework, or people assume that they live in a free, safe, democratic society. And when the power structures behind that free, safe, democratic society are threatened, it becomes very, very clear that it's a bit of a fabrication. And I think that the G20, it's not that anything out of the norm for the surveillance sort of infrastructure, the policing infrastructure of North America and of Canada. It's not that anything special happened there. That these are like this sort of harassment and violation of civil liberties. Like, these things happen every day. They just happen to marginalized people, and when it happens to a bunch of young, 20-something white kids who are mostly imported from the suburbs onto the streets of Toronto to talk about economic injustice, all of a sudden people pay attention.